How much is someone like you worth, billionaire? Mason Calloway asked, his voice flat and cold, eyes not looking directly at the man standing before him. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet, held it up to his face as if about to bestow something. And then he tore the bill in half right in front of everyone in the hotel lobby. The ripping sound of the paper money was clear and sharp, scraping at the dignity of the man across from him. Mason held out one half of the bill. "Take it. This is what you deserve." The man, black, thin, wearing old clothes, standing awkwardly at the hotel entrance, looked up. His eyes were glazed with hunger. His hands shook as he reached out to take the torn bill. But Mason didn't stop. He turned and walked toward the VIP elevator area, not quickly, not slowly. He kept the other half, waving it like a reminder. "Want the rest? Follow me." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. Before the doors closed, he pressed the half bill against the glass, turned to look at the man still standing, confused, under everyone's gaze in the lobby. "Want this half?" Mason smirked. "Then get to work." The elevator doors closed. The man stood still. In his hand was only a useless half of a bill. Behind him were the stares of several guests who had just entered. A woman shook her head. A security guard let out a short laugh. Someone pulled out a phone and took a photo of the moment. The beggar gripped the torn bill, then slowly lifted his head. No one knew at that exact moment a test had begun. And as the man was about to walk away, Mason's voice rang out from behind this time, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Oh, and don't bother trying to exchange that half for cash. No one will take it." He chuckled softly. The laugh had no sound, only emptiness, as if savoring a petty amusement. The man stopped. His hand clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. A receptionist whispered to a coworker, "Boss is doing another secret test again." But the other replied softly, "No, this time, it looks like real humiliation." Behind him, quiet laughter began to spread. Not loud, but enough for the man to hear clearly. He still stood there. No reaction, no begging, just bowed his head, slipped the torn bill into his pocket. The elevator corner lit up. A journey had silently begun, but no one knew the one being pushed to the bottom was the one being pushed to the very limit in order to rise. "Follow me." The voice of a security guard called out from behind. No explanation, no waiting for a response. The man silently followed, his hand gripping the torn bill in his coat pocket. They walked through a hallway lined with shiny stone, then turned into a narrow stairwell leading down to the service floor. The farther they went, the yellower the light became, the colder the air, thick with the smell of chemicals and rust. They stopped in front of an old metal door. The guard opened it, said nothing, then walked away. Inside was an employee restroom, small, dirty, the toilet overflowing, the floor smeared with brown-black stains, even a trail of dead cockroaches along the baseboard. Mason Calloway was already there. Black suit, silver belt, leather gloves. He didn't touch anything. He looked around as if the air itself was too filthy for him to breathe. "Clean it." His voice was cold as steel, his eyes without a flicker of emotion. The man swallowed hard, but did not react. "No gloves, no cleaner, only a bucket and a rag." Mason nudged a metal bucket under the sink. "When the floor is clean enough to see your reflection, go upstairs." Before leaving, Mason took the remaining piece of the bill, half of a $100 note, from his breast pocket. He didn't say a word, just silently pressed it onto the mirror, right at the eye level of the man kneeling down. Then he turned and left the room as if shedding a smell. The door closed behind him. No lock clicked, but no one waited for him to come out. He bent down. His hands plunged into the cold bucket. The stench made his eyes water. Every stroke of the rag on the floor felt like scraping away his own dignity. A few employees walked by, glancing through the slightly open door. One muttered, "Unbelievable, all that just for a torn piece of paper." Another scoffed, "Maybe he thinks it's a ticket to a new life." But the man didn't answer. He didn't stop scrubbing, either. When the last grime around the toilet rim was scraped away, and the whole room smelled of old soap, he stood up, wiped his face with his sleeve, then looked at the mirror. The half bill was still there, not missing, not moved. but not any closer, either. The man who had just finished cleaning the toilet was told to go up to the lobby. He stepped out of the service elevator, still smelling of cleaning chemicals, his hands red from scrubbing. He didn't have time to ask what to do next when a staff member handed him a mop and pointed straight to the center of the lobby. There are no one. Shoe marks. Clean it. The hotel lobby was crowded. Guests in suits, evening gowns, pulling luxury luggage, chatting in languages he didn't understand. He bowed his head, walked into the middle of the lobby, and began mopping. Laughter broke out as a glass of red wine spilled onto the white carpet. I spilled it. Who's gonna clean it up for me? Mason's voice rang out, louder than necessary. He was standing by the bar, holding a second glass of wine, smiling lightly. All eyes turned to him. Hey, you! Not going to clean it, Mason called. No mop, then use your hands. A few laughs burst from a group of young guests. Someone pulled out their phone to record. The man hesitated. Then he knelt down, using his bare hands to wipe up each drop of wine spreading on the carpet. A doorman standing far away shook his head. Damn it, Mason's at it again. They're even filming it, someone else whispered. What for? To post to Darmanana. For fun, Mason chuckled. He again took the half bill from his pocket, still crisp. Not a bit more torn than leisurely walked past the kneeling man and stuck it onto the marble countertop of the bar. You want it, here it is. There's a guest slipping over there. He pointed to a wet spot near the elevator. The man looked up, eyes burning. But then he lowered his head again, walked over to the wet spot, and quietly cleaned. In that moment, no one saw him as a human being anymore. That afternoon, the hotel had a closed shareholders meeting on the 9th floor. A large shipment of audio equipment, bottled water, and documents arrived, but there was no staff assigned to carry it. Mason showed up right on time. Jacket slung over his shoulder, coffee cup in hand. Hey, you! Got hands, don't you? Carry these up to the 9th floor for me? The man bowed his head, said nothing. He just squeezed the piece of bill in his pocket and stepped forward. There were 6 boxes. Each weighed no less than 25 kilos. No card. No one to help. Service elevator temporarily out for maintenance. One at a time. I don't want you collapsing dead in the hallway, Mason said, taking a sip of coffee, then walked away. The man bent down, picked up the first box. His shoulders ached. Tendons in his hands turned red. Sweat soaked the back of his shirt. Every time he made it up one floor, he had to stop and rest. While carrying the 4th box, a hotel worker opened the door on the 7th floor and saw the scene. The person paused for a few seconds, then smiled faintly and closed the door. On the 9th floor, when he set down the last box, his knees buckled from exhaustion. Right then, Mason stepped out of the meeting room. In his hand was the half bill. Still the same one. Well done. But looking at you, I wonder, should I really give it to you? He leaned down, stuck the bill to the glass door of the meeting room, right at eye level with the man kneeling on the floor. When you're done with the work downstairs, come back. Then he walked into the room. The glass door closed, leaving the man's quiet reflection facing the half bill, fogged with the breath of exhaustion. After setting down the last box on the 9th floor, the man was called down to the basement to help unload newly delivered gas stoves. No one asked his name. No one called him staff. Everywhere he went, he left a trail of sweat stains spreading across the tiled floor. He carried the second gas cylinder, his steps unsteady. His left hand was bleeding from a cut on a metal latch from a previous box. No one offered him a bandage. In the lobby, a few guests passing by saw him, mistook him for an employee, and someone even asked, "Excuse me, which floor is the spa on?" He nodded, "We're not knowing," then bowed his head and kept walking. By the time he collapsed in the hallway on the 6th floor, still clutching the half bill in his pocket, his vision blurred. Everything spun. High heels clicking, laughter, the ding of the elevator. He couldn't stand up anymore. He sat with his back against the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest. Blood welled in his palm, but he still clutched the crumpled paper. His eyes looked through the glass door, where one figure reflected clearly himself. A security guard walked by, paused for a second, then shook his head and left. Someone in the distance called, Hey, didn't finish unloading the boxes and you're just sitting there. No one called him a person. No one remembered his name. Only the piece of paper in his pocket, the thing he thought was hope, now felt like a chain. He closed his eyes. And in the darkness, the question echoed for the first time in his head. Is that bill really worth destroying myself for? If I do this, will you keep your word? Late afternoon? The second floor hallway was empty, fluorescent light casting long shadows on the wall. The man was led to an old wooden door, the paint peeling. No nameplate, no sign, just a piece of paper taped on with handwriting, a storage room. The door swung open with a soft creak of its hinges. Inside, a black, square box, dusty, with a rusty iron handle. It sat in the center of the room, as if waiting. Mason was already there, leaning in the corner, coat open, cup of tea in his hand. "Do you see it?" he said, his voice as calm as if asking about the weather. "Carry it up to the 9th floor, to the meeting room at the end of the hall." The man didn't answer, only looked at the box. It wasn't too large, but the way it sat there, heavy, brazen, like a silent challenge. He walked over, bent down, tried to lift it. His hand shook at the very first touch of the handle. It was heavy, unusually heavy. He bit his lip, gripped tighter. His back bent. Veins bulged on his arms. His legs slipped a bit as he tried again. Mason didn't help. Didn't ask anything. He just lifted the teacup, blew gently, took a sip, then slowly set it down on the windowsill. "Oh, almost forgot." He reached into his coat and took something out, a piece of paper folded in half. Half of a $100 bill. Still the same one. He gently wedged it into a gap on the box's rim, right at the man's eye level. "When you deliver it to the 9th floor, maybe I'll reconsider." Mason smirked. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, but then bowed his head. No questions, no reaction. Just bowed his head, squared his shoulders, and began to lift the box. Out in the hallway, each step was as heavy as dragging his whole body inside a coffin. With every step, his wrist burned. At every turn, his back ached. People passing by looked. No one helped. A staff member looked up, saw the scene through the door gap, shook his head and whispered, "Probably some decoration." "Mason's got someone carrying stuff again." The person beside him shrugged. "That's what hotel security does. That's their job." But he wasn't staff. He was just a shadow dragging himself up stair after stair. At the landing on the 7th floor, he dropped to his knees. Head bowed, sweat dripped onto the floor like silent tears. In his shirt pocket, the first half of the bill, still there. Crumpled, sweat-stained, dirty. He raised his hand, touched his pocket lightly, then looked at the box. And for the first time, he spoke aloud. Very softly, just enough for himself to hear. "If I do this, will you keep your word?" Then he stood up, braced his shoulders, and kept climbing. Nothing was in his eyes at that moment, only the path to the 9th floor, and a torn piece of paper mocking his whole life. 8th floor stairwell. He stopped, gasping for breath, leaning against the wall. At that moment, the hallway light flickered, then went out for a second. And darkness brought back memories. He was standing in a convenience store, holding his last $100 bill. It was raining outside. Police cars wailed past, but he only looked at the cashier and quietly asked, "Do you have almond milk for children with lactose intolerance?" The cashier nodded and brought out a small bottle. He held out the bill, his hand trembling. The child stood behind him. A little girl, thin, round black eyes, tightly curled hair, wearing worn sandals. She hugged an old rag doll, one button eye already missing. He smiled at his daughter, patted her head. "Daddy bought it. Let's go home." But then the police sirens came closer. An officer walked into the store, looked around, then approached him. "Is your name Marcus Drew?" He turned around. His eyes were vacant, as if his soul had already left. The hallway light flicked back on. He opened his eyes. Sweat drenched his neck, his hand still gripping the wooden box's handle. Pain too deep for words, but it had never left his shoulders all these years. The small rented room, moldy walls, dim yellow light. He sat next to a rickety crib. blowing on the milk bottle he just bought, checking the temperature. The child, about 2 years old, lay curled up under a thin blanket, breathing with a wheeze, cheeks sunken from fever. By the bed was an eviction notice, mixed in with debt papers and unpaid electricity bills. By the window, a woman with curly hair, her face tired but gentle, was folding children's clothes. Each time she finished folding, she looked up at him. "We'll be all right, won't we?" she asked, her voice softer than the ceiling fan. He didn't answer. He just stepped over, hugged her. His hand rested on hers. It was trembling, but he held on tight. Outside, sirens sounded again. This time not police. An ambulance. Surety here. During the short interim, red lights flashed through the window like blood seeping through the night. Wind from the 9th-floor vent pulled him back to the present. He gripped the handle of the box tighter. His shoulders shook for a moment. Just a few more stairs. He walked. Not for money. Not for that torn piece of paper. But because in his chest, where his daughter's laughter used to echo, where the cry "Daddy" once rang, now there was only a draft of wind. And the heavy box on his back, as if it carried all the past he never got to bury. What if I get there, and no one is there? Then what? The 9th-floor elevator doors opened, and the atmosphere changed immediately. No more noisy voices, no more background music from the lobby, only silence, as if this place had been separated from the rest of the hotel. The man stepped out, his shoulder drooping from the weight of the wooden box pulling his back into a curve. The hallway lights were bright and cold, stretching all the way to the end where there was a large black double door, a brass plaque embossed with the words "Board Meeting Room." The thick carpet muffled his footsteps. But for that very reason, each step felt stuck to the ground, forcing him to strain his whole body forward. He walked slowly, very slowly, as if moving toward a final judgment. Each step reminded him of all the times he'd struggled through these hallways. But this time, it was for half a bill and a promise never quite clear. Just a few meters from the doors, he staggered, dropped to one knee. Hand braced on the box, gasping for breath. Head bowed low. A bead of sweat fell onto the pristine carpet, a drop like blood in the silence. No one came to help. No one was waiting. He gripped the box handle, stood up once more, and took the last few steps. When he arrived, he set the box down, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Silence. But then, the door creaked open, as if someone had gently touched it from inside. He pushed gently. The door opened wide. Empty. A long room, a big conference table in the center, overhead lights glaring white. No one. No chairs. No sign any meeting had taken place. Only one thing placed precisely in the center of the table, not even a millimeter off. Half a bill. Still the same one. He stood frozen in the doorway, not stepping in. Air from the AC made the piece of paper flutter light as a final mockery. In his breast pocket, the other half was still there. Crumpled. Stuck tight with sweat and dust. He didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just looked at the bill as if looking at himself split in two and displayed like a joke with no audience. He hadn't even stepped inside when footsteps sounded behind him. Light. Steady. Refumorm. Worshariuar. Rhythmic. Mason. No one knew when he'd appeared right at the door, holding a cup of hot coffee, his face expressionless. "You found it, did you?" he asked, his tone as casual as if talking about the TV remote. The man turned around, nodded. His hands shook as he set the box down at the threshold. "Give me your half," Mason held out his hand. He froze. "I thought..." "No. No. You hold one half, I hold one half. Now I think that's enough." The man hesitated, blinking rapidly. Then he pulled the crumpled bill from his pocket and placed it in Mason's hand. Mason folded it, didn't even look at it, then tore it in half again. The man was stunned. Both halves were now 4. "You still want to be paid?" Mason asked, tucking 2 torn pieces into his pocket. "What now?" the man whispered. Mason turned, pointed to the cart left in the hallway. On it was a large wooden suitcase, even bigger than the previous box, wrapped with rope, labeled "Fragile." "Wheel that down to the basement. Room 03. Don't break it. Don't scratch it. The man looked at the cart, then at his hands swollen, blistered, red. There's no elevator, Mason added. You don't have a key card. Then he turned and walked away, without a word of thanks. The man looked at the meeting room door, then at the half bill still sitting there. Not enough to live, not enough to die, just enough to know he hadn't escaped this game. The suitcase was heavier than the previous box, so heavy that he couldn't push it without leaning his whole body forward to tip the cart. The wheels squeaked on the carpet, then jolted hard as they hit the stone floor. He gasped for breath, each inhale tearing at his chest. People walked past. No one stopped. He asked a nearby employee, the basement storage, which way? The woman pointed toward the service stairs. The staff elevators locked. No one said anything else. He hunched his back, pushed the cart toward the stairs. First step, the cart jerked. The suitcase nearly flipped. He caught it in time, his hand slamming painfully against the wood. Step by step, the cart felt like it wanted to drag him down. His hands were swollen and purple, his wrists aching. Halfway down the stairs, the light was dim. A rat scurried by. No one saw. No one cared. When he reached the basement, his legs were weak. His back felt broken in two. Storage room Aero 3's door was ajar. He pushed the suitcase inside, started to turn away. Then jumped inside was a woman in a receptionist uniform, standing with a clipboard. You're late, she said, emotionless. The board meeting's over. He didn't understand. Just delivering this? Someone will come pick it up soon. Wait outside for confirmation and signature. Only then do you get your reward. Again, this game. He walked out, back straining painfully straight, stepping into the cold, unheated corridor. Only a flickering red bulb hung at the end of the ceiling. He leaned against the wall, breathing. His hand touched his chest. No more piece of money. Only breath and bruises no one could see. Before he could catch his breath, he heard footsteps from the back stairs. Two men, clothes tattered, walked into the basement corridor. He recognized them immediately. They were the two homeless men who had helped him carry the first box up to the 9th floor. The thinner one nodded in greeting. We've been looking for you. The other scowled. You said after delivering the box, you'd give each of us $25. Right? He nodded. I'm still waiting for them to confirm. I haven't got the money yet. Haven't got it, the other man frowned. We heard Mason already got in his car and left the hotel 5 minutes ago. He was stunned. I didn't know. They told me to wait. Wait, the big man's voice tightened. So you're not planning to pay us? No, You tricked us, the other cut in, stepping closer. Made us carry hundreds of pounds through the hotel lobby, and now nothing. No, he backed away. I'm just like you. I haven't received anything either. Then why aren't you looking for him? Why are you standing here gasping like you just won? The other stepped forward. If you don't have the money, you'll pay in flesh. He didn't even have time to react. The first punch slammed into his chest. He fell to the floor, his head hitting the wall. A ragged shoe kicked into his side. He tensed his body to take the blows, trying to shout, I have nothing, I really have nothing. But they didn't listen. The sounds of fists, shoes, scuffling echoed through the empty basement. No one came. No one knew. Just a man who once believed in half a bill collapsing under a debt that wasn't even his. He lay motionless against the cold basement wall, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth onto the gray cement, blending with a line of leaking water. One of his shoes, kicked off, lay abandoned a few steps away. The pain in his left side stabbed with every breath, making him afraid to move. The tube light overhead flickered, its patchy glow casting the shadow of someone who was once a man, now just the remains of humiliation. No one came. No footsteps. Only the sound of air conditioning hissing through the vent, like a mocking laugh. His trembling hand fumbled in his pocket, empty. No piece of money left. No promise. No witness. He muttered something, unclear whether it was a call for help or just a last, ragged breath. Then a faint rustle as a weightless scrap of paper was blown to him by the wind, stopping right beneath his hand. He squinted. It was a flyer. The paper's edge was creased, bearing the hotel's logo. He lifted his hand, as hard as if lifting the weight of his whole body. He had to squint to read the ink-blurred line. Hiring logistics staff. Meals and housing provided. Opportunity for full retraining from the start. At the bottom, someone had written in red pen, "Opportunity isn't for those who quit halfway." He stared at that line for a long time. The bulb overhead buzzed once more, then went out. In the darkness, his breath was still there, weak, but not yet gone. 3 years later, the lobby of the Beaumont Grand Hotel was still as bright as ever. Bellhops still pushed luggage carts. The jazz band still played in the late afternoon, and the front desk always had someone adjusting their jacket and tie every minute. But today, the atmosphere was a little different. Mason Calloway, billionaire investor, founder of the hotel chain, appeared unexpectedly. No advance notice, no entourage. Just him, a perfectly fitted black suit, and those familiar ice-cold eyes. He strode to the counter. His footsteps still carried authority. The receptionist immediately bowed. "Where's the new manager?" Mason asked, straight to the point. "He just handled a billing issue at the restaurant." "I'll call him right away." The receptionist bowed politely. In less than a minute, he appeared. Marcus Forrest-Shortentelon. No more scruffy beard. No more wrinkled clothes. A crisp white shirt, gray tie, name tag on his chest, Marcus Drew, operations manager. Mason turned to look. His eyes were indifferent at first, but in just 1 second, his pupils froze. They faced each other. Marcus stood straight, nodded slightly. No smile. No bow. No longer the man who once dragged himself around for half a bill. Mason was silent. The whole lobby was silent. A reporter nearby recognized him, Mason Calloway, once caught in a scandal for testing his staff, and who lost 3 chains after gambling on the morality of the poor. Cameras flashed. Marcus said nothing. He simply stepped back, gestured for Mason to enter the main lobby. "What do you need from your hotel today?" he asked, his voice calm. Mason was stunned. For a moment, his face showed a strange expression outplayed, right in the very place he once ruled. Mason walked into the main lobby. People automatically stepped aside. No one told them to. No one reminded them. It was just habit when seeing the man who once ruled this hotel empire. Marcus walked behind, steps slow, holding the afternoon staffing schedule in his hand. He didn't introduce Mason to anyone. No boasting, no bowing. The crowd murmured. A few department managers looked up, briefly surprised to see Mason, but immediately lowered their heads to their desks again. Mason passed the rows of tables. His eyes stopped at a photo hanging on the wall, a team of staff smiling brightly. Marcus in the middle, holding the certificate for Best Manager of the Year. A young server approached Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, the guests at VIP Table 7 want to thank the manager personally for the dessert." Marcus nodded. Before leaving, he turned to Mason. "Have a pleasant afternoon." He spoke calmly, but with not a hint of deference. Mason pressed his lips together. Did not answer. There was nothing more that needed to be said. No apology. No explanation. Marcus walked away, his figure fading behind the restaurant doors. Mason stood there for a moment, eyes following the empty space. He touched his breast pocket and felt a crumpled scrap of paper. It was a piece of the bill from years ago, one he had kept, then torn, then forgotten. He quietly squeezed it in his hand. The crowd no longer cared. Now, the one left behind was him. 1 week later, a small recruitment desk was set up in the side lobby of the hotel. A wooden sign was carved with bold letters, "Internal Recruitment, Second Chance Opportunity." No flashy lights, no banners, just 3 tables, a few white plastic chairs, and one man sitting in the middle, Marcus. He was talking to a young woman in her 20s, eyes avoiding his, hands trembling as she placed her application on the table. "When I was little, I stole things from the supermarket," she murmured. "Now I want to work again. No one will hire me." Marcus looked at her. "Here, no one has never made mistakes. What matters is whether you want to change." She looked up, nodded. He handed her the rule test sheet. No special treatment, no priority. Everything was like for every other candidate. In the corner, a middle-aged man with a gray beard, once a security guard but fired for running his mouth, stood in line with his arm bandaged. Marcus signaled the staff to brew more coffee. Bring water to those waiting. No VIP seats. No cutting in line. A former employee whispered, "He's not just working, he's restoring trust." A Monday morning, third floor management office, Marcus's desk. Light shone through the frosted glass, highlighting the faded edges of his nameplate. He was organizing the recruitment files when he noticed a small envelope mixed in with the papers. No address, no sender's name, only one word on the front: private. Inside, it was the piece of paper he thought he'd lost forever. The other half of the $100 bill, the tear still sharp, the paper still soft, the old crease still visible. Marcus's hand froze. He pulled his wallet from the drawer where he'd kept the other half for 3 years. He put them together. A perfect fit. On the back of the bill, in old man's handwriting, was a note. "Sometimes we have to break it to see who's willing to fix it." Marcus stared at that line for a long time. No need to ask who wrote it. No need for confirmation. He stood up, walked to the window. A light breeze carried the smell of morning coffee from the floor below. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, scrolled to the name M. C, private line. Didn't press call. Just looked in. Then typed a message. "I still have both halves. And I still remember who tore it. Thank you. Truly." He pressed to send. Then quietly took the bill, placed it in a small glass frame, set it next to his Employee of the Year certificate. Not to spend, not to put away, just so that anyone who enters this office would know every great beginning starts from a tear. He had just placed the bill in the frame when the office door gently opened. A tall figure, light gray coat, silver sunglasses, stepped in. Marcus turned. His eyes met the visitor's, Mason Calloway. No entourage. No announcement. Just standing there in silence. Marcus stood still. For a second. Then, his eyes lit up. Like a soldier meeting again the man who once pulled him from the trenches. Like a fan, unexpectedly meeting a legend he'd only admired from afar. He stepped forward. Did not shake hands. Did not speak. He bowed his head not out of rank, but respect. Mason said nothing. He just looked at the small glass frame on the desk. He nodded slightly, turned and left. The door closed. But Marcus's eyes stayed there like someone who had been enlightened by the very hand that once tore the bill, and then handed back an entire life. That's how it is. Just a torn bill can split open an entire person. One jerk of a car, one cold statement, one dismissive glance sometimes. It's not cruelty, but a mirror reflecting our own will. Have you ever been humiliated by someone in front of others? Have you ever found yourself bowing your head just to grab the last half chance? And if today someone handed you half of what you most desired, would you walk away out of pride? Or would you step forward not for your ego, but because you know you deserve a different ending? Marcus chose to keep going. Not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to let the past decide the road ahead. And Mason, the man who tore the bill, might be the villain in your eyes. But to Marcus, he was the first to dare look into his weakest part and take a chance. What about you? If one day someone tears your dream in half, how will you react? Stay until the end. The twist will redefine what redemption truly means. If you witnessed injustice like this, what would you do? Comment below. Subscribe to Unveiled Wealth, where kindness sparks redemption and silence breaks power.